in the heart of a young America, where ambition blinded compassion, one of history's most haunting journeys began. A journey where thousands walked not toward a dream, but away from home. This is the story of the Cherokee Nation, a story written not in ink, but in tears, in blood, and in the unbroken will of a people who refused to disappear. They called it Nunadal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. But what began as exile became something far greater, a testament of endurance, faith, and rebirth. From the misty hills of Georgia to the windswept plains of Oklahoma, this is not just the story of suffering. It is the story of survival. Through war and hunger, betrayal and rebirth, the Cherokee carried with them the flame of their ancestors, a fire that refused to die, a fire that still burns today in every heartbeat of their nation. Welcome to History Teller YT, where history breathes, where pain becomes poetry, and where the past walks beside us once more. Stay with me as we journey across 2 centuries of struggle and spirit. This is the Trail of Tears, the tragedy of forced removal and the triumph of survival. In the early 19th century, the United States stood at a crossroads, a young nation hungry for expansion, yet morally blind to the cost of its ambition. The lush southeastern lands, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee, were home to the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. To the white settlers, these territories looked like opportunity. To the native people, they were sacred homelands filled with ancestral graves, hunting paths, and living memories. These civilized tribes, as the government called them, had schools, farms, written constitutions, and even bilingual newspapers. They had done everything the U.S. had asked to prove their ability to coexist. Yet, their success only made settlers more envious. Cotton was booming. The promise of fertile soil ignited a fever that no treaty could contain. Behind polite words of progress and civilization, there was a darker agenda: to seize the land by any means necessary. When Andrew Jackson became president, the fate of Native America changed forever. Jackson, a war hero and a man of iron will, saw indigenous presence as an obstacle to white prosperity. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, empowering the government to negotiate the voluntary exchange of native land for Western territory. But there was nothing voluntary about it. State governments, especially Georgia, began to defy federal treaties, passing harsh laws that stripped Native people of their rights. The Cherokee were forbidden to meet as a government, forbidden to mine gold on their own land, and even forbidden to testify in court against a white man. Still, they resisted through petitions, through peaceful protest, through the American legal system. Their leader, Chief John Ross, fought tirelessly, believing that justice would triumph in the Supreme Court. In Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, declaring their sovereignty. But Jackson allegedly sneered. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. It was a declaration of tyranny, law bent to serve conquest. Even after the legal victory, fear spread through Cherokee towns. Families whispered of soldiers, forced marches, and rumors of relocation camps. Missionaries wrote letters describing children crying as their villages were surveyed for white settlers. The federal agents came with contracts promising gold, cattle, or tools in exchange for centuries of heritage. A few leaders, under pressure and deception, signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, giving away all Cherokee land east of the Mississippi. Most of the tribe never agreed to it, yet the Senate ratified it by a single vote. What followed was not a negotiation, but an eviction. Within 2 years, soldiers would round up men, women, and children, forcing them into stockades under armed guard. The Cherokee called it Nunadaltsuni, the trail where they cried. The tragedy had begun, but it would also reveal a story of unimaginable endurance and human spirit that history could never erase. By the spring of 1838, the calm hills of Cherokee Nation no longer echoed with laughter or drums, but with the heavy boots of soldiers. Under orders from General Winfield Scott, nearly 7,000 U.S. troops fanned out across Georgia, Tennessee, and Alabama, surrounding every Cherokee village. They came at dawn, rifles gleaming, horses snorting in the mist. The government had declared that removal must be completed by summer. The Cherokee were given no time to prepare, no time to grieve. Entire families were pulled from their homes at gunpoint. Pots still simmered on fires. Bibles lay open on tables. The soldiers locked the doors and burned the cabins after they were emptied, ensuring no one would ever return. The people, confused and terrified, were herded like cattle toward makeshift prison camps called stockades. Mothers clutched infants, elders stumbled with canes, and children cried for their fathers taken elsewhere. Even those who had fought beside American troops in earlier wars were given no mercy. To the soldiers, they were not allies or neighbors anymore. They were obstacles to be moved, bodies to be counted, names to be erased. The Cherokee homeland, green and breathing with sacred rivers, was being turned into a graveyard of memories. The stockades were cages built from timber and cruelty. Around 16,000 Cherokee were confined in roughly 24 camps scattered across the southeast. The government called them immigration depots, but they were little more than open-air prisons surrounded by disease, hunger, and despair. Food was scarce: rancid pork, moldy cornmeal, dirty water. Disease spread quickly: dysentery, measles, fever. By early autumn, as the air grew crisp and the leaves turned red, the Cherokee realized the unthinkable. They were leaving forever. Groups were organized for the march. Men, women, and children divided into detachments of roughly 1,000 people each. Chief John Ross begged the government to allow his people to lead their own removal rather than be marched under military command. After months of suffering in the stockades, the government finally agreed. It was a small mercy amid enormous injustice. Before departing, many Cherokee returned to their villages one last time. They knelt on the earth, touching the soil, whispering to their ancestors, "We will return," they said, even though in their hearts they knew they would not. Some carried jars filled with their homeland soil, others small stones from rivers they loved. When the first groups began to move out in late October 1838, frost covered the ground. Wagons creaked, oxen groaned, and barefoot children tried to keep pace with the soldiers' horses. Behind them, smoke rose from the valleys, the smoke of their burned homes. The trail of tears had begun in silence, under a gray sky that neither blessed nor wept. But soon, that silence would be broken by cries, songs, and the echo of footsteps that stretched across a continent. In late October 1838, the first Cherokee detachments began their westward march under the cold breath of early winter. The government had promised supplies, food, wagons, and protection, but the promises were thin as the icy wind that cut through their clothes. Families walked hundreds of miles through mud and frost, carrying only what they could hold in their arms. There were no proper shoes, no blankets, no shelter from the rain. The route stretched over 1,200 miles, winding through Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas before reaching the new Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. The soldiers riding alongside carried muskets and orders, but not compassion. At night, the Cherokee huddled near weak campfires, their breath rising like smoke ghosts into the black sky. Mothers whispered prayers to keep their children alive through the night, while old men told stories to remind the young who they were, the people of the mountains and rivers, not of exile. The sound of wagon wheels grinding over stones became a grim heartbeat of their suffering. Those who could not walk were loaded into wagons. Those who fell behind were left behind. Every sunrise brought fewer voices. Every step westward felt like another farewell. As November turned to December, the march became a nightmare of hunger, sickness, and snow. Food rations promised by the army rarely arrived. When they did, they were spoiled, frozen, or crawling with insects. People boiled bark and roots to survive. Some ate the leather from their shoes. Streams and ponds froze, forcing them to drink dirty runoff. Disease swept through the camps: dysentery, pneumonia, and typhus. The wagons often carried more bodies than supplies. Missionary witnesses wrote that the road was lined with the sick and dying, and the soldiers grew weary of burying them. Mothers were seen digging shallow graves with their bare hands, whispering farewells to their dead children before the march continued. There was no time to mourn. The army's schedule demanded movement, always movement. The snow turned red with blood from cracked feet. At night, wolves howled from the dark woods, drawn by the scent of death. And yet, the Cherokee endured. Their songs became softer, slower, but they sang still. These songs were not for entertainment, but for remembrance, a language of survival, defiance, and love. Every melody was a promise that their people's spirit would not die, even if their bodies did. By December, temperatures plummeted across the Mississippi Valley. The ice storm of 1838 to 1839 became one of the cruelest winters in living memory. Crossing the Mississippi River was an ordeal that broke even the strongest hearts. Sheets of ice drifted down the current, cracking and crashing against the ferries. Some detachments waited for days in freezing camps with no food, no firewood, and no dry clothes. Witnesses recalled the cries of babies freezing in their mother's arms, and the silence of men who had lost everything. Even soldiers began to die from exposure. The Cherokee prayed for morning light, but even daylight brought no relief. Only another day of walking toward an uncertain land. When the river crossing was finally complete, the survivors looked back one last time. They saw only white mist and gray water, erasing all trace of where they had come from. Behind them lay thousands of unmarked graves. Ahead lay hundreds more miles of cold and suffering. And yet, the Cherokee walked, not because they had hope of comfort, but because stopping meant death. Their tears froze on their cheeks. Their shadows stretched across the ice. This was not a journey of choice, but of endurance, written not in ink, but in blood and frost. Through the long winter nights of 1838, the Cherokee carried not only the weight of hunger and death, but also the fragile light of faith. Around every campfire, elders prayed in their native tongue, speaking softly to the spirits of ancestors who had once danced on the same soil that now froze beneath their feet. "We are still here," they whispered, believing that words could bind the living to the dead. Missionaries who accompanied the caravans wrote of haunting scenes: men singing hymns over shallow graves, women clutching Bibles and whispering Cherokee psalms. One described a mother cradling her dying child, her tears turning to ice before they reached the ground. Even in such agony, there was dignity, an unbroken spiritual defiance that no musket or winter storm could erase. The Cherokee faith, a blend of ancient reverence and new Christian hope, gave meaning to survival. Each prayer was not a plea for rescue, but a statement of existence. We endure. In that endurance lay resistance, quiet, invisible, and stronger than any soldier's command. To the outside world, they were a defeated people marching into oblivion. But within their songs and murmured prayers, the Cherokee carried a secret power, memory. Among the marchers, the most heartbreaking faces were the children. Barefoot and shivering, they walked beside parents who could no longer promise them safety. Many were orphans before the journey ended, their mothers and fathers buried in unmarked snow. Witnesses told of small hands clutching each other, forming little chains of courage in the cold. Soldiers reported finding children asleep beside the bodies of their parents, refusing to move. The silence of those moments was unbearable. Yet even the smallest among them carried stories, legends of the mountains, the rivers, the sacred fire that once burned at the heart of their villages. At night, when the wind howled through the camps, some elders told these tales to keep the children's hearts alive. The fire will never die, they said, even though no real fire could survive the snowstorm raging outside. Many white settlers along the route watched in horror as the processions passed their farms. Some secretly offered food or blankets, risking punishment from soldiers. A few recorded what they saw in diaries, leaving us words like, "It was a sight to melt the heart of stone." The Cherokee children, frightened, frostbitten, and silent, became the embodiment of a nation's innocence betrayed. Despite starvation and misery, the trail was not only a march of submission, it was also a trail of defiance. The Cherokee resisted in the smallest ways that history almost forgot. Some slipped away under the cover of night, hiding in caves or dense forests, surviving off roots and wild berries. These refugees of the hills became legends, families who refused to surrender their homeland. Others rebelled through song, refusing to let their language die, even when forbidden to speak it aloud. Women braided their hair with strands of home soil, carrying their past within their bodies. Warriors, though disarmed, protected the weak by forming circles around the elderly and the sick at night. Chief John Ross, whose own wife Quad-Eye died from cold during the journey, continued to lead with calm resolve. He buried her beside the frozen trail, then kept marching, his grief becoming the face of his people's endurance. Soldiers could break bodies, but not spirit. Every mile of the trail became an act of remembrance, every prayer a rebellion against extinction. The snow fell endlessly, but beneath it, the Cherokee soul burned with a quiet fire that refused to die. By December 1838, the Mississippi River, wide, cruel, and half-frozen, stood like a wall between the Cherokee and the unknown land they had been promised. 4 generations, the river had been a symbol of freedom and life. Now it became a test of endurance, a final barrier for a dying nation. When the first detachments arrived, the wind cut like knives through thin blankets and torn moccasins. The ferries sent to carry them across were overloaded, creaking under the weight of wagons, oxen, and the sick. Ice drifted in great sheets, slamming against the hulls and sending waves of freezing water over the passengers. Children screamed as icy spray drenched their faces. Mothers held them tighter, whispering prayers through chattering teeth. Some fell into the water and vanished without a sound. Others froze where they sat, their bodies stiff before morning. Witnesses described the crossing as a march through hell made of ice. The Mississippi had become both a grave and a mirror, reflecting the faces of a people watching their world disappear behind them. On the far shore lay Indian territory, barren, strange, and silent. Behind them, their homeland faded into mist and memory, like smoke blown away by the wind. The crossing took weeks. Detachment after detachment reached the banks only to wait for passage as snow fell endlessly, blanketing the camps in white despair. Firewood ran out. The soldiers grew impatient, while the Cherokee grew weaker. Disease spread like fire. Smallpox, pneumonia, and fever took hundreds. Each dawn, frozen bodies were lifted from the ground and placed beside the trail. There were no coffins, no ceremonies, only hurried burials beneath thin layers of snow. The Mississippi became known among them as the River of Death. Even animals refused to move forward. Oxen collapsed on the ice, horses died midstream. Yet, amid this horror, there were moments of fierce love. A father carrying his sick daughter gave her his only coat, shivering until he could no longer walk. She survived, he did not. A mother, unable to feed her baby, sang to it until her voice broke, the child dying in her arms. Soldiers turned their eyes away. Some wept in secret. The brutality they had enforced now haunted them. Letters from missionaries recorded these moments of unspeakable grief, writing that the Almighty Himself seemed to weep upon the river. When the final groups crossed in January 1839, the frozen water carried away not just lives, but the last remnants of hope that the old world could ever return. When the Cherokee finally stepped onto the western bank of the Mississippi, they entered a world they had never seen before, a flat, endless expanse of prairie and wind. There were no mountains, no familiar trees, no rivers that spoke their language. It was as if they had walked into another planet. Many collapsed upon reaching the shore, too weak to take another step. Others fell to their knees, scooping the strange earth into their hands, whispering to it as though trying to make it remember them. The soldiers announced that their destination lay still hundreds of miles ahead, through more cold, more hunger, more loss. But the Cherokee, bound by exhaustion and grief, moved forward in silence. The landscape seemed empty, yet within that emptiness, there was something else, a whisper of resilience. Survivors began to speak softly of planting again, of building again, of living long enough to remember. The Mississippi lay behind them like a scar dividing life and death, past and future. They had crossed more than a river. They had crossed the edge of their world. The trail of tears was not over yet, but something deeper was beginning. The struggle to make meaning out of survival itself, and to rebuild identity from ashes and snow. By February 1839, the remaining Cherokee detachments reached the edge of what the government called Indian Territory. To the exhausted survivors, it looked nothing like a homeland, just miles of cold prairie, wind-swept ridges, and scattered timber. There were no towns, no shelter, no harvest waiting. The federal promise of prepared houses and stored food had been another illusion. Soldiers pointed vaguely westward and left, their duty complete. The Cherokees stood in silence, surrounded by emptiness. Some collapsed where they stood. Others knelt, pressing their hands to the unfamiliar soil as if trying to sense its spirit. The land was hard and unwelcoming, soaked with rain that froze each night. The people had marched more than 1,000 miles, losing nearly a quarter of their number along the way. Men, women, elders, children, even leaders. Now, they were told to begin again. Fires were lit from damp wood that smoked and hissed in the wind. Families built crude huts from branches and animal hides, trying to keep out the bitter cold. Hunger still haunted them. The dead from a journey were left behind, but their absence filled every camp. The land was new, but grief was everywhere. It clung to the air like mist. When spring arrived, the thaw revealed the full measure of devastation. Out of nearly 16,000 who began the removal, more than 4,000 had perished. Their graves lay scattered from Georgia to the Ozarks. Yet the Cherokee did not surrender to despair. Guided by surviving leaders, Chief John Ross, the Ridge family's remnants, and the spiritual elders, they began to rebuild what had been destroyed. Councils met beneath rough shelters, writing new laws and electing representatives. Fields were cleared with makeshift tools. Corn was planted in soil that felt foreign beneath their feet. Women wove baskets and blankets to trade with neighboring tribes, while blacksmiths hammered salvaged metal into plows. The children, thinner and quieter than before, were gathered for lessons, reading, arithmetic, and the old stories of their people. Ministers rebuilt churches. Medicine men rekindled sacred fires. The Cherokee Phoenix newspaper, once silenced by removal, was reborn in handwritten copies that passed from hand to hand. Every act of rebuilding was both labor and prayer. They were determined not to vanish into history's margins. "We will make this land our own," said one elder, "but we will not forget where our hearts remain." The wind carried his words across the prairie like seeds of memory. Survival came at a terrible price. Families were divided forever, some still hidden in the Smoky Mountains, others lost along the trail, and a few who had accepted earlier removal treaties now living apart in resentment. Factions formed, those loyal to Chief Ross and those who had signed the Treaty of New Dakota. The wounds of betrayal ran deep. In the summer of 1839, vengeance erupted. Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, 3 signers of the treaty, were assassinated by fellow Cherokee who held them responsible for their people's suffering. Blood stained a new homeland before the first crops had ripened. Grief turned inward, poisoning trust. The nation that had endured the trail of tears now faced the threat of tearing itself apart. Yet amid vengeance and sorrow, there was also reflection. The people understood that survival meant more than breathing. It meant preserving the essence of who they were, their language, their law, their spirit. Around evening fires, the elders reminded the young, "We are still Anianwia, the real people. The white man took our land, but not our soul." Their words rose into the twilight, mingling with smoke and a memory of those lost. The trail had ended, but the journey toward healing had only begun. By 1840, the Cherokee Nation in Indian Territory was a wounded body trying to remember how to breathe. Its heart, its leadership, was divided between those who had resisted removal and those who had signed the Treaty of New Dakota. Chief John Ross, still mourning the loss of his wife, Quatai, on the trail, struggled to unite his people. He moved through the camps quietly, visiting the sick, speaking to the young, and meeting with elders beneath canvas tents that flapped in the dry wind. Yet he knew that trust was fragile. Many blamed the treaty signers for everything: the deaths, the suffering, the humiliation. Their assassinations in 1839 had left the nation in shock, trapped between justice and revenge. In council meetings, Ross urged reconciliation. "If we destroy each other," he warned, "then the white man's work is finished." His words carried the weight of exhaustion, but also of vision. The Cherokee had endured the cruelty of the government. Now they faced the cruelty of division. To rebuild, they would need more than new laws. They would need forgiveness. And forgiveness was harder to find than food. The once mighty nation that had built schools, farms, and a written constitution in the East was learning again how to speak to itself without bitterness. In the spring of 1840, under Ross's leadership, the Cherokee began to hold national conventions. Delegates traveled from every settlement across the western lands, arriving on horseback or on foot, carrying with them the hopes of thousands. They met near Tahlequah, which would become the new capital of the Cherokee Nation. The council fire was lit again for the first time since the removal, a symbol of continuity, of life rising from ruin. The flame flickered against faces lined by grief, but also determination. Here, the Cherokee drafted a new constitution, reaffirming the principles of their eastern homeland: equality, elected leadership, and education. The Cherokee Supreme Court was reestablished. Schools were opened where children learned both English and Cherokee syllabary, keeping alive the genius of Sequoyah's writing system. Churches rose beside council houses, their bells echoing across the plains. For the first time since the trail, laughter returned to the camps. Farmers began to till the land, finding that corn could grow even in foreign soil. The nation's flag, red and blue with a 7-pointed star, fluttered above the council grounds, a reminder that though they had been exiled, they were not erased. Every heartbeat of the new government was a quiet act of defiance against extinction. Rebuilding government was only part of survival. The soul of the Cherokee Nation depended on restoring faith, both spiritual and communal. Ministers preached that God had not abandoned them, but the old priests, keepers of the sacred fire, whispered that the Creator had only moved their people to test their endurance. At night, the two beliefs mingled around the same flames. Hymns mixed with ancient chants. The Cherokee understood that faith was not a single path, but a bridge between their ancestors and their descendants. Women became the backbone of renewal. They led prayers, taught the children, and tended small gardens that became symbols of hope. Each seed planted was a promise to the next generation: we will rise again. Festivals slowly returned. Green corn ceremonies, dances of remembrance, songs of loss and survival. They did not celebrate victory, they celebrated endurance. From the ashes of division and exile, a new identity began to take form. Not one defined by defeat, but by the power to adapt without forgetting. As the smoke rose into the sky, carrying their prayers with it, the Cherokee people declared through action what words could barely express: that even on stolen land, they would keep their spirits sovereign, their hearts unbroken, and their story alive for eternity. Before the trail, there had been a man who saw further than most: Sequoyah, also known as George Guess, a blacksmith and visionary from the Cherokee Nation. He believed that a people without written words would one day vanish. Around 1821, after years of ridicule and isolation, he gave his people a miracle: the Cherokee syllabary, a complete written language made of 85 symbols. It allowed every Cherokee, regardless of class or age, to learn to read and write within weeks. Literacy spread faster among them than among most white Americans. By the 1830s, they published books, kept official records, and even printed the Cherokee Phoenix, the first Native American newspaper, carrying both English and Cherokee columns. But the Trail of Tears nearly silenced this voice. Presses were destroyed, papers burned, and teachers killed or displaced. Yet even in the camps of exile, mothers traced the symbols in the dirt for their children, whispering meanings by candlelight. They knew that the written word was not only knowledge, it was memory, identity, resistance. To forget their script would be to lose their soul. When Sequoyah himself later traveled west to join his people, he found devastation, but also the faint, stubborn spark of the written fire he had lit years before. After resettlement in Indian Territory, Sequoyah's invention became a bridge between the broken past and the uncertain future. In a land stripped of everything familiar, the Cherokees still had their language, carved into their hearts and now preserved in ink. Missionaries who had once tried to suppress native tongues began printing Bibles and hymns in the syllabary, astonished by how easily people read them aloud. Councils recorded laws in both English and Cherokee. Letters passed between families separated by miles of wilderness, carrying not only words but emotions too deep for translation. The syllabary became a form of quiet rebellion, a way to speak freely in a world that sought to erase them. Literacy rates among the Cherokee soared higher than those of many frontier towns. Sequoyah, now older and frail, traveled through villages teaching the script, encouraging unity. "Our words are our nation," he told them. "If they live, we live." He dreamed of one great language linking all native tribes, a vision far ahead of its time. Though some mocked his ambition, his message spread, that a pen could guard a people's future as powerfully as a weapon once guarded their land. In every written word lay survival. When Sequoyah died around 1843, deep in the western lands near the Rio Grande, his body returned to the earth, but his creation never died. His syllabary became the lifeline of a culture that refused to disappear. Through it, the Cherokee remembered their ceremonies, recorded their laws, and wrote letters to Washington demanding justice. Even as new generations grew up far from the Smoky Mountains of their ancestors, they could still speak to the past through those symbols. The Cherokee language carried stories of betrayal, of snow and hunger, of loss and rebirth. Scholars later called it one of the greatest linguistic achievements in human history, a fully developed written system created by one man with no formal education. But for the Cherokee, it was something deeper. It was proof that they were still a nation. In classrooms across Indian Territory, children recited the syllabary, their voices rising like songbirds after a long storm. Each line of script became a prayer, each page a resurrection. The syllabary had survived soldiers, exile, and the cruelty of empire, and through it, the Cherokee reclaimed the right to define themselves. Their language, once nearly lost to the wind, had become eternal, a voice stronger than death itself. When the Cherokees settled in Indian Territory, their bodies were scarred, but their spirits burned with the embers of faith. Before the removal, Cherokee spirituality had lived in balance with nature. Rivers were sacred veins, fire the breath of the Creator, and the earth itself a living being. The trail had shattered much of that harmony. Many sacred sites, from the Blue Ridge Mountains to the Etowah Mounds, were left behind forever. Yet in exile, faith became both a wound and a refuge. Missionaries had walked with them during the removal, carrying Bibles and hymns. Some had shared their food and wept beside them. Christianity, once foreign, began to intertwine with the old Cherokee beliefs, not as replacement, but as adaptation. Churches rose beside traditional council fires. On Sundays, hymns were sung in Cherokee, their tones bending the European melody into something ancient. They prayed to God, but also whispered to the spirits of ancestors beneath the same breath. This fusion, neither purely Christian nor purely traditional, gave birth to a new spiritual identity. It was a way to survive without forgetting, to believe in redemption without erasing memory. Their faith was not submission. It was resilience dressed in prayer. At the center of Cherokee tradition lay a sacred fire, the eternal flame representing life, unity, and renewal. During the forced removal, the original fire had been extinguished, a devastating symbol of rupture. But when the Cherokee reached their new home, the elders decided it must be rekindled. In the spring of 1840, a small group of priests gathered under a thatched roof near the Illinois River in present-day Oklahoma. They carried embers wrapped in clay pots, fragments of the last fire that had burned in their eastern homeland. As dawn rose, they placed those coals into new wood and sang the old songs. Smoke rose into the pale sky, twisting like a spirit reborn. The people gathered silently, many weeping, as the fire caught flame once again. From that day forward, it would never be allowed to die. Women tended it day and night, feeding it cedar and tobacco, symbols of life and purity. Around it, they held their councils and their ceremonies, the green corn dance, the purification rites, and songs for the dead. The new fire became the soul of the Western nation, proof that though the Cherokee had been exiled, their divine connection remained unbroken. To them, the fire was not just flame, it was survival itself. Faith, both old and new, became the medicine that healed what the trail had broken. Ministers preached of hope in the language of the people, reading the Gospels in the Cherokee syllabary that Sequoyah had given them. Congregations gathered under open skies, where voices rose like wind through grass. Christianity among the Cherokee did not erase their identity. It transformed it into something uniquely their own, a faith of the wounded, but not the defeated. Meanwhile, traditional healers kept the ancient rituals alive, blending herbal medicine with prayer. Every gathering became an act of unity. Christians and traditionalists standing side by side, both seeking meaning in their suffering. They began to interpret the Trail of Tears not only as tragedy, but as sacred trial, a journey through which the Creator tested their endurance. Out of destruction came spiritual evolution. Their prayers no longer asked, "Why have we been punished?" but "How shall we honor those who walked before us?" This question became the heartbeat of their nation. In every church bell and every flickering council flame, the answer echoed: by surviving, by remembering, by passing faith forward. And so, through prayer and fire, the Cherokee learned the deepest truth of all, that belief, when born from pain, becomes the strongest shield against extinction. After the trail, the Cherokee Nation's greatest wound was not only physical, but political. Betrayal had divided the survivors as deeply as the Mississippi had divided their journey. The Treaty of New Echota, signed in secret by a minority of leaders without the consent of the majority, haunted every council meeting and every family gathering in Indian Territory. Chief John Ross, the principal leader who had fought against removal, tried to bring unity, but suspicion lingered in every shadow. In 1839, when the Ridge family and Elias Boudinot, the signers of the treaty, were assassinated, it was both an act of vengeance and an explosion of long-suppressed grief. Yet these killings deepened the fracture. Now the Cherokee stood at risk of destroying themselves from within. Ross moved cautiously, balancing justice and forgiveness, aware that the U.S. government watched eagerly for signs of weakness. Washington officials hoped the tribe would dissolve into chaos, making it easier to control them through new policies. But Ross understood that survival required more than land or treaties. It required unity. He reached out even to those who had once betrayed him, declaring, "We must live as one people again, or not live at all." His words carried through the camps like wind over ashes, calling a broken nation to rise. By the early 1840s, the Cherokee Nation began rebuilding its political heart. Under Chief Ross's leadership, a new constitution was adopted in 1840, reaffirming the rights of self-governance, justice, and law. The capital was established at Tahlequah, a word meaning two is enough, symbolizing unity from division. Council houses, schools, and courthouses rose from the red earth. The Cherokee Supreme Court once again began hearing cases, conducted entirely in Cherokee language. This act itself was defiance, a statement that they were still a sovereign people. The United States government, however, saw sovereignty as a threat. Washington sent agents to monitor every law passed, every council held. They tried to push assimilation policies, urging the Cherokee to abandon their customs and fully adopt American ways. Yet Ross and his council refused to surrender their autonomy. They balanced diplomacy with defiance, writing petitions, sending envoys to Congress, and documenting every violation of treaty promises. The press, revived through the Cherokee Advocate, printed sharp editorials demanding accountability. Though exiled and diminished, the Cherokee government was one of the most sophisticated indigenous administrations in North America. Its survival proved something the U.S. could not erase. That even in exile, the Cherokee Nation still governed itself, still dreamed for its people, and still spoke with one voice. Beyond the official politics, resistance took many forms. Cherokee men and women began to use the tools of the colonizer, education, law, and language, to fight for justice. Young leaders traveled to Washington, learning English not to bow, but to argue in the language of power. Women like Susanna Ridge and Catherine Brown organized community schools and taught literacy as resistance, believing that knowledge was a shield against erasure. Preachers spoke of moral strength and unity, transforming sermons into subtle calls for political defiance. Even farmers joined this quiet rebellion, growing crops collectively and refusing government aid to prove self-reliance. Every field tilled, every word printed, every school built became an act of independence. Meanwhile, the government continued to push boundaries, offering new treaties that promised peace and friendship, but concealed further control. The Cherokee learned to read between the lines, to anticipate betrayal, and to answer not with war, but with endurance. As one elder said, "They may take our land, but not our minds." In the face of injustice, the Cherokee had discovered a new kind of resistance, not one fought with arrows or guns, but with intellect, unity, and unyielding dignity. Their struggle became a silent storm, echoing across generations as proof that survival itself was an act of rebellion. In the story of the Trail of Tears, history often remembers the generals and the chiefs, but behind them were the women, the true pillars of endurance who carried the nation forward when everything else fell apart. During the removal, it was the women who buried the dead, fed the children, and comforted the elders. They walked hundreds of miles barefoot, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, yet their spirits refused to collapse. When soldiers grew impatient, they sang lullabies to silence the crying infants, using songs that had been passed through generations. When food ran out, they gathered roots and boiled leaves to keep their families alive. One observer wrote that Cherokee women bore the suffering of an entire nation in their arms. They were healers, midwives, and mourners all at once. Even after reaching Indian territory, when men were broken by grief or anger, it was the women who lit fires in the new settlements, rebuilt homes, and reminded their people of who they were. They carried not just children, but culture, language, and memory. Through them, the Cherokee spirit survived. Without the women, the Trail of Tears would have ended not with exile, but with extinction. Long before the trail, the Cherokee had been a matrilineal society, meaning family lineage, property, and even clan identity were inherited through the mother's line. Women were not just caretakers. They were lawmakers, landowners, and decision makers. The clans, Wolf, Deer, Paint, Bird, and others, traced descent through mothers, and no important decision was made without the voices of women. This tradition of female strength carried into exile. In Indian territory, women took leadership roles quietly but firmly. When men debated vengeance or surrender, women often spoke for mercy. insisting that the nation could not heal through blood. Some formed councils to distribute food, organize aid for widows, and teach orphans the old songs. Among them, Nancy Ward, remembered as the beloved woman, became a symbol of compassion and wisdom, even years after her death. Her legacy inspired later generations of Cherokee women to balance power with empathy. They understood something deeper than politics, that nations die not from war, but from the loss of humanity. Every time a mother told a story to her child, every time a grandmother taught the syllabary by firelight, they were rebuilding the soul of their people. Their leadership was quiet but absolute, the invisible government of survival. As the 1840s progressed, Cherokee women began shaping a new generation. Many turned to education as a weapon of healing. They founded small schools beneath trees and in wooden huts, teaching children to read both in English and Cherokee. They believed literacy was not just a tool, but a shield, a way to protect their children from exploitation and ignorance. Others returned to traditional medicine, using herbs and spiritual ceremonies to heal wounds that no doctor could touch. Healers like Sally Ridge and Onawake became known for treating the body and the soul, reminding people that sickness often began with despair. At community gatherings, women recited prayers, danced, and prepared feasts that celebrated survival rather than victory. Through every small act, planting corn, weaving baskets, writing letters, they created continuity in a world that had been ripped apart. They became the bridge between what was lost and what could still be saved. Their courage was not loud or celebrated, but it was constant, a heartbeat beneath the nation's silence. In every generation that followed, the Cherokee would remember that while men may have led the march, it was women who kept the people alive. Their strength became legend, their resilience the foundation of a reborn nation. The children who survived the Trail of Tears carried in their small bodies the silent trauma of an entire nation. They had seen things no child should ever see: parents buried in shallow graves, friends collapsing in snow, soldiers shouting orders that tore families apart. Many were too young to understand why they had to leave home. They only remembered the cold, the hunger, and the long road that never seemed to end. After the march, orphan children wandered through the new settlements, clutching rags or fragments of jewelry from their mothers. Missionaries and elders tried to care for them, but there were too many, thousands of small faces with eyes too old for their years. These children became living memories of the trail, carrying its grief into every new dawn. Some forgot their language, others refused to speak at all. Yet even in their silence, they held the spirit of the nation. Elders gathered them at night around campfires, telling them stories of the mountains, rivers, and sacred animals. "You must remember," they said, "the land still knows your name." In those moments, memory became medicine. Though their childhood had been stolen, their purpose was forming. They would grow into the keepers of remembrance. By the mid-1840s, the Cherokee Nation began to invest deeply in the education of its young. Chief John Ross and other leaders believed that the only way to ensure survival was through knowledge, both modern and traditional. Schools were built across Indian territory, often funded by the Cherokee Nation itself, not the U.S. government. Children learned arithmetic, reading, writing, and history, but also Cherokee law, songs, and myths. In these classrooms, teachers reminded students that literacy was a weapon against ignorance and oppression. The Cherokee Male Seminary and Cherokee Female Seminary would later become some of the most advanced schools in the region, teaching subjects that even many white settlers' children never studied. But education was not only about books, it was about rebuilding pride. Children were taught that being Cherokee was not a shame, but a heritage of strength. When they read about the trail and their lessons, it was not as a story of defeat, but as a story of endurance. "We are here," said one teacher, "because they could not kill our spirit." Every word they learned, every song they sang, was an act of defiance. Through education, the Cherokee turned memory into empowerment, and the children became the nation's future architects. As decades passed, the children of the trail grew into adults who carried both scars and purpose. They became teachers, ministers, farmers, and lawmakers in the rebuilt Cherokee Nation. Their memories of hunger and frost hardened into wisdom and resolve. They built towns with schools, newspapers, and markets, living proof that survival was not the end of the story but the beginning of renewal. Many kept journals, preserving first-hand accounts of the trail for generations yet unborn. These writings, some found decades later, revealed voices that trembled with pain but refused to fade. They understood that forgetting was the true death of a people. Parents told their children about the trail, not to reopen wounds, but to teach strength. "You are the dream of the ones who walked," they would say. Even today, among Cherokee descendants, stories of ancestors who survived the trail are told with tears and pride. The children of that sorrow became the authors of hope, living bridges between past and future. Their existence proved that the Trail of Tears did not end in silence. It continued in songs, in books, in the rhythm of footsteps walking forward. Through them, the Cherokee story transformed from tragedy into testament, from suffering into survival. By the 1850s, the Cherokee Nation had risen from the ruins of removal with a determination that astonished even its oppressors. Under the leadership of Chief John Ross, the Cherokee built one of the most advanced indigenous governments in North America. The new capital, Tahlequah, stood as a living symbol of rebirth, its streets organized, its buildings proud, its council house echoing with debates of law and liberty. The Cherokee Constitution mirrored the democratic framework of the United States, but retained the spirit of their own traditions. Elected representatives, a bicameral legislature, and a judicial system worked in harmony with age-old clan values. The Cherokee Supreme Court heard cases in both English and Cherokee, upholding fairness as the nation's highest law. Taxes were collected, schools funded, and trade flourished across the territory. Visitors described the Cherokee capital as more civilized and orderly than many frontier towns. Even after the nightmare of exile, the people refused to remain victims. They became architects of progress, proving that sovereignty could live again even in exile. The Trail of Tears had burned their old world to ash, but from that ash rose a government stronger, wiser, and unbroken. Education became the crown jewel of Cherokee renewal. The establishment of the Cherokee Male Seminary, 1851, and Cherokee Female Seminary, 1852, marked a new dawn. Modeled after top American and European institutions, these schools offered courses in philosophy, mathematics, literature, and science. Their students read Shakespeare, studied geometry, and learned both Cherokee and English fluently. It was said that graduates from the Cherokee seminaries could match the intellect of any university scholar in the United States. Beyond academics, the arts flourished. Cherokee writers, poets, and musicians began to record their experiences, weaving history into creative expression. Printing presses resumed work, publishing the Cherokee Advocate, which carried articles on politics, education, and spiritual life. Cultural festivals returned. Dances, storytelling gatherings, and the sacred green corn ceremonies that celebrated renewal and gratitude. The people wore traditional dress proudly, while embracing progress. A visitor to the capital once remarked, "Here stands a nation reborn, living proof that civilization does not belong to race but to resilience." The Cherokee had turned learning into liberation, transforming education from a tool of assimilation into a declaration of independence. By the late 1850s, the Cherokee Nation enjoyed what historians would later call its golden era. Farms stretched across the plains, industries grew, and trade routes connected Cherokee towns to neighboring territories. Prosperity was visible, schools thrived, roads improved, and the government's treasury grew stable. Yet beneath this brilliance lay quiet tension. The wounds of removal still whispered in dreams. Old divisions between treaty supporters and Ross loyalists had not entirely faded. Moreover, the growing national debate in the United States over slavery began to pull at the Cherokee's unity. Some wealthy Cherokee had adopted the practices of white planters, owning enslaved Africans and building estates. Others, remembering their own suffering, condemned the institution as hypocrisy and sin. These ideological cracks foreshadowed coming storms. Still, for a time, hope prevailed. Children laughed in schoolyards where once silence had ruled, and the council fire burned brighter than ever. The Cherokee had done what few nations could. They turned tragedy into triumph, forging light from loss. But destiny was not finished with them. A new war loomed on the horizon, one that would once again test their survival, their unity, and the meaning of freedom itself. By 1860, the Cherokee Nation stood at the height of its reconstruction, educated, prosperous, and politically strong. But beyond its borders, the United States trembled on the edge of disunion. The winds of the Civil War began to blow, and the Cherokee found themselves trapped between two powerful forces, the Union and the Confederacy. Both sides courted the tribe, promising protection and autonomy in exchange for loyalty. Old memories of betrayal by Washington made the South's promises sound appealing, but others feared repeating history's mistake. Chief John Ross, cautious and wise, urged neutrality. "We are a people already wounded by another nation's war," he said. Yet neutrality was impossible. Geography placed the Cherokee deep within the Confederate frontier, surrounded by Southern troops. Pressure from slaveholding Cherokee elites also grew. They saw their fortunes tied to the South. The nation split once again, not over land this time, but allegiance. Brothers argued with brothers. Council members shouted in rage, and families divided their loyalty. For the Cherokee, the Civil War was not just an American conflict. It was a second civil war within their own nation, threatening to undo everything they had rebuilt from the ashes of the Trail. When war erupted in 1861, it dragged the Cherokee into its chaos. Confederate envoys arrived in Tahlequah, offering weapons, money, and recognition of full sovereignty if the Cherokee would side with them. Under immense pressure, Chief Ross reluctantly signed an alliance treaty, not from conviction, but from desperation to protect his people. Yet even as the ink dried, dissent grew. Thousands of Cherokee loyal to the Union fled north, forming their own regiments under leaders like Stand Watie, a fiery orator and seasoned warrior who became the only Native American to rise to the rank of brigadier general in the Confederate Army. The Cherokee Nation tore itself apart. Battles like Pea Ridge, Honey Springs, and Cabin Creek saw Cherokee soldiers fighting Cherokee soldiers, sometimes in the same family. The war that once seemed distant now consumed their homeland again, turning fields into graveyards and council houses into ruins. Towns burned, crops died, famine returned like a ghost from the Trail of Tears. Ross himself was captured and taken to Philadelphia, where he switched his allegiance to the Union, begging the U.S. to remember the Cherokee's suffering. But in war, mercy was a stranger. By 1863, the Cherokee Nation lay shattered once more, its unity drowned beneath the smoke of cannons. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the Cherokee people faced a new kind of devastation, not from forced removal, but from moral reckoning. The Confederacy was defeated, and with it, any illusion of political safety. The U.S. government demanded punishment and retribution for those tribes that had sided with the South. In new treaties signed that year, the Cherokee were forced to abolish slavery and grant full citizenship to freed African Americans within their territory. This decision sparked deep controversy, dividing the nation yet again between traditionalists, reformers, and the newly freed. But beneath the tension lay exhaustion. Decades of displacement, division, and war had stripped the people of nearly everything, except endurance. Chief John Ross, now in his final years, dedicated himself to healing his fractured nation. "We have survived every storm," he said, "and we shall survive this one too." His death in 1866 marked the end of an era, but his vision endured. The Cherokee, once again scarred by a war not their own, began the slow work of rebuilding. The Civil War had taught them a brutal lesson. Even freedom, if dictated by others, can carry chains. And yet, the will to endure, that same fire born on the trail, still burned. The Cherokee Nation would rise again, for survival was no longer their burden. It had become their destiny. The Civil War had left the Cherokee Nation in ruins, its fields scorched, towns abandoned, and spirit fractured. Once thriving communities like Tahlequah and Park Hill were reduced to smoldering remnants. Churches stood roofless, schools were silent, and the sound of mourning hung in the air like a permanent fog. Families who had fled during the war returned to find strangers living on their land or nothing left at all. The Cherokee, who had already endured the horrors of the Trail of Tears, were once again refugees, this time in their own territory. Yet amid the destruction, there remained a will to rebuild. Chief William P. Ross, nephew of the late John Ross, rose to leadership with calm determination. His first task was reconciliation, healing a nation torn by both politics and blood. Former Union and Confederate Cherokee gathered under council fires once more, some weeping as they spoke of brothers they had lost on opposite sides. "We have buried too many," one elder said, "to keep burying each other." The land was poor, but the people's resolve was not. Even in ruin, they began planting corn again, rebuilding schools, and re-establishing courts. The war had taken their strength, but it had not broken their soul. The U.S. government, victorious after the Civil War, imposed new terms on all native nations that had sided with the Confederacy, including the Cherokee. The Treaty of 1866 forced painful concessions. The loss of additional lands, the establishment of railroad rights through Cherokee territory, and most significantly, the emancipation of enslaved people held by some Cherokee. The treaty demanded that these freedmen be granted full citizenship within the Cherokee Nation, a clause that would shape politics for generations. For some, it was justice. For others, it was another intrusion into their sovereignty. Yet despite resentment and debate, the Cherokee accepted the treaty, determined to survive within the new reality. They restructured their government, reaffirmed their constitution, and sought peace with neighboring tribes. Schools reopened with renewed vigor, teaching not only Cherokee and English, but also the painful lessons of recent history. The printing presses began again, their ink carrying words of resilience. We remain a nation. Delegates were sent to Washington to protest unfair clauses, but few listened. Still, they refused to spare. They had learned that every treaty written against them could be countered by one truth written in their own hearts: that their identity was not defined by permission, but by persistence. The late 1860s and early 1870s marked the dawn of a new Cherokee Renaissance. Despite the loss of territory and wealth, the people poured their energy into rebuilding institutions of culture and education. The Cherokee National Council resumed regular meetings, enforcing laws and funding projects that symbolized rebirth. Roads were repaired, trade routes reopened, and communication extended across the territory. The seminaries for men and women flourished once more, producing scholars, teachers, and leaders who carried both ancestral pride and modern knowledge. Writers began documenting oral traditions, ensuring that the Trail of Tears, the Civil War, and every act of endurance would not vanish into silence. The Cherokee language, preserved through Sequoyah's syllabary, was taught widely again, now side by side with English, bridging the past and future. Artisans crafted beadwork and pottery that told stories of exile and triumph. Musicians revived old songs, mixing them with the harmonies of church hymns, creating a sound both mournful and proud. Visitors to Tahlequah marveled at the transformation, calling it a civilization reborn from ruin. But to the Cherokee, it was more than recovery. It was proof that the fire from their old homeland still burned within them. Their ancestors had walked the Trail of Tears, but their descendants were walking the trail of resurrection. By the 1870s, a new generation of Cherokee was coming of age, one born after the Trail of Tears, but raised in its shadow. These were the children and grandchildren of survivors, educated in the seminaries their parents had rebuilt, fluent in both English and Cherokee, and aware that their future depended on mastering the world that had once sought to destroy them. Education had become the weapon of liberation. The Cherokee male seminary and female seminary were now among the most respected schools west of the Mississippi, employing teachers from prestigious Eastern universities. Students studied astronomy, geometry, Greek literature, and constitutional law, but also the sacred traditions of their ancestors. A visitor once remarked that the classrooms of Tahlequah were as refined as any in New England, but with hearts that beat in two languages. This intellectual awakening gave rise to new leaders, writers, lawyers, and teachers, who saw knowledge not as imitation of white civilization, but as proof of native genius. They were living testaments that progress and identity could coexist. As one young scholar wrote in his journal, "We have walked from blood into books. What they try to bury, we now teach." This generation would reshape not just their nation, but how America understood what it meant to be Cherokee. The post-war decades saw the flowering of a cultural renaissance unlike anything the Cherokee had experienced since their days in the East. Artists, storytellers, and musicians worked tirelessly to preserve what the trail and the war had nearly erased. Elders traveled from village to village, teaching the younger generation the songs of the green corn ceremony, the myths of the first fire, and the moral tales that had guided their ancestors. Women revived traditional crafts, weaving, pottery, beadwork, and basketry, infusing every design with symbols of rebirth. Each pattern told a story: a river for endurance, a mountain for memory, a spiral for the endless cycle of survival. Writers and editors of the Cherokee Advocate began publishing poetry and essays in both English and Cherokee, speaking proudly of their dual identity. Christianity and ancient spirituality coexisted in harmony. Sunday sermons were often followed by tribal dances, each expression honoring the same divine mystery. Annual gatherings celebrated the resilience of the nation, drawing thousands from across Indian Territory. The Cherokee had endured centuries of violence and displacement, but through art and faith, they had turned grief into beauty. Their songs no longer mourned exile alone. They celebrated existence itself. Every note, every word, every dance was a declaration. We are still here, and we will remain. As education and culture thrived, a new political challenge emerged. Maintaining sovereignty in a nation increasingly dominated by Washington's ambitions. The U.S. government policy of assimilation now took a new form: allotment. Under this policy, tribal lands were to be divided into individual plots, and surplus lands sold to white settlers. To the Cherokee, this was not reform but theft disguised as progress. Leaders petitioned Congress, insisting that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign government with a functioning legal system, schools, and economy, a nation within a nation. They argued that collective land ownership was not a primitive tradition, but a foundation of unity. Still, pressure grew. American politicians viewed native self-rule as an obstacle to westward expansion. Newspapers called it an empire within the republic. In council meetings, elders warned, if we allow our land to be cut, our hearts will be cut with it. Resistance became the rallying cry of a new generation of Cherokee nationalists. They wrote letters, printed manifestos, and traveled to Washington to speak before Congress. Their speeches blended eloquence with passion, invoking both the Constitution and the Creator. The struggle for sovereignty had begun anew, not with weapons or marches, but with words. Once, the Cherokee had been forced to walk a trail of tears. Now, they would walk a trail of truth, determined that history would never again write their fate without their voice. By the late 19th century, the Cherokee Nation had built a thriving society, schools, courts, a written constitution, and a literate population unmatched among indigenous peoples. Yet once again, the very success of the Cherokee drew the envy of Washington. Politicians who once spoke of civilizing native nations now feared their independence. The old tools of conquest, guns and forced marches, had given way to a subtler weapon: legislation. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Severalty Act, a law that claimed to offer fairness, but was designed to dismantle communal landholding. It promised citizenship and private property to Native individuals willing to abandon tribal ownership. To U.S. officials, it was modernization. To the Cherokee, it was betrayal in a new disguise. The government announced that tribal land would be surveyed, divided, and allotted to individuals, while any surplus would be sold to white settlers. The Cherokee Nation, once sovereign over millions of acres, now faced another forced division, this time written not in blood, but in ink. Chiefs and councilmen protested fiercely, sending petitions that reminded Congress of solemn treaties guaranteeing perpetual land rights. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. The same voice that once said remove them for their own good, now said divide them for their own progress. The war for survival had returned. Only now it was fought in courtrooms, not forests. Implementation of the Dawes Act brought confusion and heartbreak to every Cherokee home. Federal agents arrived with measuring chains and maps, slicing ancestral lands into rectangular plots. Families who had lived communally for generations now faced the impossible question: whose name would be written on the deed? The Cherokee concept of land as shared life collided with the American notion of property as ownership. Many refused to register, seeing allotment as treason against their ancestors. Others, desperate to protect at least part of their homestead, complied reluctantly. The Dawes Commission categorized every individual by blood, full blood, mixed blood, or freedmen. A cruel bureaucracy that fractured unity and reduced identity to paperwork. Within a decade, millions of acres of tribal land were lost to fraud, bribery, and coercion. Speculators bought plots from struggling families at a fraction of their worth. The Cherokee map, once vast and whole, became a checkerboard of loss. Newspapers celebrated the opening of Indian lands to settlers, calling it progress. But among the Cherokee, grief returned. Old men stared at survey flags fluttering where sacred trees once stood. Women wept as their gardens were fenced by strangers. The Dawes Act had achieved what armies could not. It broke the sacred relationship between a people and their land, turning heritage into commodity and soil into silence. Yet even in this age of deception, the Cherokee spirit refused to die. Writers and activists rose to challenge the Dawes policy, using words as weapons. Elias C. Boudinot II, grandson of the martyred treaty signer, became one of many Cherokee voices calling for justice, while younger leaders like Redbird Smith turned to tradition, forming secret societies to preserve culture and unity. Smith and his followers created the Nighthawk Kituah Society, dedicated to rejecting allotment and reviving the old ceremonies, language, and spirituality. They met in hidden groves, rekindling the sacred fire that symbolized eternal Cherokee nationhood. Their message was clear: the land is not ours to sell. It belongs to our children and their children after them. Women joined in protest, forming councils and teaching their children to remember the old ways even as new borders cut through their fields. Though the U.S. government enforced its laws, the Cherokee adapted once again, blending resistance with survival. They filed lawsuits, printed newspapers, and educated a new generation who would fight back not with weapons, but with knowledge. The Dawes Act had stripped them of acres, but not of soul. Beneath every plowed field, beneath every signature on a stolen deed, the Cherokee heart continued to whisper, "We are still the people of this land." And that whisper would soon rise into a voice the world could no longer ignore. As the 20th century dawned, the Cherokee Nation existed in fragments, its land divided, its government dissolved by U.S. policy, and its people scattered across Oklahoma and neighboring states. Yet beneath the silence, something powerful stirred. The elders still told stories in Cherokee. The sacred fire still burned in secret groves, and families still whispered the old prayers before meals. It was in these whispers that a revival was born. The early 1900s brought railroads, oil booms, and assimilation schools that punished children for speaking their native tongue. But for every attempt to erase identity, resistance grew stronger. Grandmothers became keepers of memory, teaching the syllabary at night after the American teachers had gone. Men gathered to sing traditional songs, their drums echoing against the prairie sky like the heartbeat of a buried nation. Though the U.S. government had declared the Cherokee Nation terminated as a political entity, its spirit persisted in homes, churches, and schools. Cherokee youth learned to navigate two worlds, speaking English in public and Cherokee in private. By preserving their words, they preserved their existence. The revival began not with laws or leaders, but with the quiet defiance of ordinary people who refused to forget who they were. By the mid-20th century, the whispers had become voices, and those voices began to demand recognition. The Indian New Deal of the 1930s, introduced under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, allowed tribes to reorganize their governments and reclaim limited self-rule. For the Cherokee, this was an opportunity to reawaken officially what had never died spiritually. In 1938, the people voted to reestablish a modern government under a new constitution. Leaders like William Keeler, a business executive and proud Cherokee, worked tirelessly to strengthen education, healthcare, and cultural programs. He became principal chief in 1949, bridging tradition and modernity with grace and determination. Schools began to teach Cherokee history again. Artists painted stories of the trail and the survival that followed. The language, once silenced in boarding schools, returned to classrooms. Elders who had once hidden their heritage now spoke it proudly to their grandchildren. The Cherokee Renaissance was not about nostalgia, it was about rediscovery. It told a wounded people that survival alone was not enough. They must thrive, create, and lead once more. The drumbeat of identity, which had been nearly silenced by centuries of oppression, now thundered again, steady and strong, announcing to the world, "We are still here, and we are still Cherokee." The latter half of the 20th century marked the full reemergence of Cherokee sovereignty and pride. In 1971, for the first time since the 1900s, the Cherokee people elected their own principal chief by popular vote. Rosso, Swimmer, followed later by visionary leaders like Wilma Mankiller, the first woman to hold that title. Under their leadership, the Cherokee Nation flourished economically, politically, and spiritually. Wilma Mankiller, in particular, became a symbol of renewal, championing education, healthcare, and women's rights while reviving traditional governance. Her voice carried the strength of her ancestors, the women who had walked the trail, buried their children, and still rebuilt their homes. During this era, the Cherokee language revitalization movement expanded rapidly, with immersion schools and cultural preservation programs taking root. Scholars and storytellers collaborated to document oral histories, songs, and sacred ceremonies that had survived in secrecy for generations. The Cherokee people once again had a government recognized by the United States, not as wards or dependents, but as a sovereign nation. From the ashes of removal, the Cherokee had built a modern identity rooted in ancient truth. The Trail of Tears had once sought to erase them. Instead, it became the foundation of their rebirth, a reminder that even in exile, they had found eternity within themselves. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Cherokee Nation stood not as a relic of survival, but as a living civilization reclaiming its voice. Yet, beneath the progress, modern government buildings, universities, and thriving businesses lay an ancient heartbeat that pulsed with memory. Across Oklahoma, Georgia, and Tennessee, descendants began retracing the steps of their ancestors, walking sections of the original Trail of Tears in solemn remembrance. These journeys were not just historical reenactments. They were spiritual pilgrimages. Elders and youth alike carried torches, songs, and soil from their ancestral lands in the East, blending them with earth from Oklahoma. "We walk to remember," one young participant said, "and to forgive what history cannot erase." In museums, the artifacts of exile, a child's moccasin, a broken clay pot, a Bible written in Cherokee syllabary, were displayed not as symbols of tragedy, but of endurance. Annual commemorations drew thousands, their prayers rising like smoke over the hills that once echoed with cries of loss. The Cherokee understood that remembrance was not about reopening wounds, but about healing them. The trail was no longer just a path of suffering. It had become a bridge between generations, between grief and grace, between the silence of the past and the voice of today. The act of remembrance soon transformed into a cultural renaissance that touched every aspect of Cherokee life. Language programs flourished, reviving the beautiful cadence of Tsalagi, the Cherokee tongue. Elders taught songs that had not been sung publicly for over a century, their melodies trembling with both sorrow and pride. The Cherokee Nation launched immersion schools where children learned math, history, and science entirely in Cherokee, ensuring that the language of Sequoyah would live forever. Artists sculpted monuments and murals depicting the journey. Families in snow, mothers carrying children, elders looking toward the horizon, and placed them in public squares as both art and testimony. Poets wrote verses in Cherokee and English, weaving memory with hope. Filmmakers, musicians, and historians began telling the story to the world, no longer through the lens of tragedy, but through triumph. The old spiritual fires were rekindled during cultural festivals, where thousands gathered to dance, feast, and celebrate survival. Healing, the elders said, comes not from forgetting pain, but from transforming it into power. Each drumbeat, each word spoken in the old tongue, became a declaration that the Cherokee spirit had not been erased by removal, assimilation, or time. It had simply waited for its moment to rise again. In this modern age, the Cherokee people have turned remembrance into strength and sorrow into unity. The Trail of Tears, once a symbol of displacement, now serves as a unifying force, a shared history that binds Cherokee communities across states and nations. Descendants from both Eastern and Western bands, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina, the Cherokee Nation, and the United Keetoowah Band in Oklahoma, began to collaborate closely in cultural, educational, and political efforts. Together, they established the Trail of Tears National Historic Trail, stretching over 5,000 miles and crossing 9 states, ensuring that every step of that dark journey would be honored and protected. Annual memorial walks, documentaries, and youth exchange programs connect young Cherokee to their ancestral roots. They learn not only the story of suffering, but of resilience, of a people who transformed grief into identity. The phrase, "none adult Sunni," the trail where they cried, has come to mean something greater, the trail where they survived. In the hum of city streets and the quiet of mountain paths, the Cherokee story continues to echo, not as a lament, but as a promise. The tears of their ancestors became the seeds of their rebirth, and from that sorrow, a new world of unity and pride continues to grow. The story of the Cherokee is not a story of defeat. It is the story of a fire that refused to die. When the first flames of their sacred fire were carried from the east during removal, they seemed fragile, flickering against the wind of despair. Yet even through the march of death, that light endured. In the years that followed, it burned quietly in hidden groves, in whispered prayers, and in the hearts of those who remembered. Today, that same fire burns openly once more, symbolizing continuity across centuries of pain and perseverance. In modern Cherokee ceremonies, when the sacred flame is lit, it connects generations. The elders who walked the trail, the children who learned the stories, and the descendants who now stand on free soil. The smoke rises into the sky, as if carrying a message to those who suffered long ago. Your sacrifice was not in vain. It is said that when the wind moves through the pines of Oklahoma or the mountains of North Carolina, it carries the voices of ancestors who walked that endless trail. Their footsteps may have faded from the earth, but their spirit walks still in every Cherokee home, in every child learning the syllabary, and in every song that begins with gratitude. The fire lives because they refuse to let it die. The Trail of Tears remains one of the darkest chapters in human history, a mirror reflecting both the cruelty and the courage of humankind. It exposes how greed and ignorance can destroy, but also how faith and unity can rebuild. For the Cherokee, the trail was more than a journey of forced exile. It became a sacred testament of resilience. From that suffering emerged lessons that echo far beyond their nation. It teaches that identity cannot be erased by borders, that language can outlive silence, and that a people's soul is stronger than any empire's law. The Cherokee learned to survive not through vengeance, but through wisdom, preserving knowledge, embracing education, and using peace as a form of rebellion. Their story speaks to all who have been displaced, silenced, or forgotten, that dignity is not given by governments, but carried within the human heart. In a world that still sees exile, division, and intolerance, the legacy of the trail calls for compassion, justice, and remembrance. To walk that path today is to walk in the presence of ghosts who do not demand sorrow, but understanding. Every tear that fell upon that trail watered the roots of freedom, and those roots have grown into a living forest of memory and hope that the world must never allow to wither again. As the sun sets over the rolling plains of Oklahoma and rises again over the misted mountains of the east, the Cherokee Nation stands whole once more, not as it was before 1838, but as something even stronger. The children of those who once cried now laugh and sing in schools where their ancestors' language is spoken again. Artists paint the faces of their elders in vibrant colors. Storytellers pass on the sacred myths that once faced extinction. The Cherokee flag waves proudly, its seven-pointed star glowing like the eternal flame of their unity. Modern Cherokee doctors, engineers, writers, and leaders continue to carry forward a legacy of endurance, reminding the world that the Trail of Tears was not the end, but a beginning. The ancestors who walked that trail gave their descendants more than sorrow. They gave them the strength to rise from it. As the final words of remembrance echo in the air, one truth remains clear. No empire lasts forever, but the spirit of a people who remember who they are will never fade. The Cherokee Nation walks today not in chains, but in triumph, guided by the same sacred fire that survived the snow, the hunger, and the silence. Their story is not just American history. It is human history, the unbreakable proof that even through the darkest journey, the soul of a nation can light the world. You have just walked the Trail of Tears, step by step, voice by voice, through the centuries of sorrow and strength. You have heard the cries of mothers, the courage of warriors, the wisdom of elders, and the unyielding spirit of a nation that would not die. From the agony of removal to the rebirth of a people, the Cherokee story teaches us a truth that transcends time. That no empire can erase a people who remember who they are. Their tears became rivers of resilience. Their silence became songs. And their fire, the eternal Cherokee fire, still burns today, lighting the path for every generation that dares to endure. Today, we do not mourn. We remember. We honor those who walked that impossible road, and we celebrate the people who rose from its dust stronger than ever. Because the Trail of Tears was not only a journey of grief, it was the beginning of a greater journey. A journey of spirit, survival, and the unbreakable will of the human heart. This was the Trail of Tears, 1830s, brought to you by History Teller Whitey, where stories of pain, faith, and endurance are reborn through voice and time. If this journey touched your heart, remember to stay with us. For every story we tell carries the soul of those who came before. Until next time, keep the fire alive and keep walking the path of history. Would you like me to now create a short trailer narration script, 45 to 60 seconds, something you could use as a YouTube intro teaser or reel to promote this 2-hour film before release?